We have a fantastic panel, which I'll introduce now. We have a really immense lineup of speakers here to discuss these questions, which are so germane to our time and so much in the spirit of the study of North America and Canada and U.S. relations, which we're undertaking here today at our conference. So just to introduce our speakers in order of their seating right now. Christopher Sands is a senior research professor, and he's the director of the Center for Canadian Studies at the Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies, also known as SAIS, at Johns Hopkins University. He's also a non-resident senior associate of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, both in Washington, D.C. And there's so much to say about Chris and his depth of knowledge, his profound well of knowledge on Canada and U.S. relations. He's a leading American, Washington-based Canadianist. That's how I would describe Chris Sands. His insights have helped American and Canadian policymakers understand the issues, the stakes, and all the angles of the Can-Am-US, the Canadian-US puzzle. And he's done this through such upheavals as the original NAFTA and its negotiation, the halcyon days of the end of history, the fraught years that followed 9/11, and of course, the cataclysm of the global financial crisis, the environmental diplomacy of President Obama and Prime Minister Trudeau, and of course, present events. Chris is a Canadianist by training. He holds a PhD from JHU SAIS. And the most unique thing about him that I would say is not his expertise in the details of these matters, which he knows, but his nose for diplomacy, his understanding of the complex nature of diplomacy and high affairs of state. Sitting beside him, a man who needs very little introduction in this room, but I'm going to make him listen to one anyways. Chris Ragan. He's the director of the Max Bell School of Public Policy. He's the chair of Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission. Of course, he's known to everyone here as the founder of the Max Bell School and as a teacher, and he's known in the halls of power in Canada as a sage advisor for his advice on monetary policy, on fiscal policy, and for the creativity of his efforts to advance environmental regulation in Canada. And of course, though, he's known to tens of thousands, if not maybe even hundreds of thousands of Canadians, as the author of the textbook that they studied when they first started to study economics, which is a huge imprint on our country and will be felt, I believe, for decades to come. And then sitting beside him is Rania Papageorgiou. Rania is a lead economics analyst at Citadel Global Fixed Income, itself perhaps the leading hedge fund investing in global bond markets and currencies. So she knows a thing or two about what's happening right now in monetary policy, in fiscal policy, and around the world. Her background is work at the IMF, work at the Bank of Canada, research connected to the Institute for International Finance, and of course studies at Johns Hopkins. Her expertise is global monetary policy, it's global trade policy, it's deep regional expertise in the economies of Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Europe. The list goes on. How many of us could say that for ourselves? So with no further ado, we're going to begin our conversation now about what's next. We'll look into the murky future.
Thanks very much, Dom, and thanks for having us.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure, and I think we're all happy to have the three of you here to talk to us. And so, if there's one thing that we all know, it's that we live at a moment of great change. And if there's one thing that the McGill University community, at its best, has always understood, it's that research and thinking and guidance from our reflections can really help us. Politics isn't just speeches, it's storytelling, it's statesmanship, it's leadership. So let's start to ask about some of the issues that are really on our minds. Let's talk about the mood right now in Canada-US relations. I know that sounds vague, but Chris Sands, I'd love to hear your take. Talk to us about the current moment in global politics and how the changes in the Canada and US relationship fit in to changes in the global political milieu.
Well, that's a nice small topic. Thank you very much. And
we go big.
You do go big, which is fitting because we're honoring Tom Belk. And I have to say, just as a little entree, SAIS, the school that I went to and now teach at, where Rania and also Dov studied, has always benefited from the relationship with McGill, which has largely been a relationship with Tom Velk, who sent some really great students. I see Todd Fox there down for us. And I think we have done our best not to mess them up, but we've always benefited by having them well trained here. So it's a great credit to you, Tom. Thank you again. So the mood is highly disruptive, disrupted by the appearance of Donald Trump. And I was going to see how long I could avoid saying his name, but I obviously have failed.
He wasn't mentioned at all.
He wasn't mentioned at all before? Oh, gosh, I'm sure he's crying about that, to be honest. He's quite sensitive. So Donald Trump has come in, and in some ways is a very unusual president for the United States because he doesn't come from the establishment, and he rode a wave of anti-establishment fervor into office. And because so many people in the Republican Party he would normally call on to guide policy, the sort of old hands you're used to, we do have Republican and Democratic experts who always swan in as soon as their team takes over. He really brought in a group of people who were amateurs or outsiders because so many Republicans were never Trumpers and refused to work with him. And so many of the things that he's done, I think, have been seen as a result through that lens. He's not said things the right way. He's not approached things the right way. And significantly, as probably, no disrespect to Joe Biden and or Bernie Sanders, will be the last U.S. president from the baby boom generation, which has challenged the authority of received wisdom from the first day, really, that they became politically aware. He has really shown a kind of disdain or disregard for the niceties of Canada's relations. To be fair to him, I've heard this going all the way back to Bill Clinton, where officials come forward and say, well, yes, we're always nice to Canada, they're our best friend, blah, 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 but why? Why should Canada be any different than any other country? What do they do that makes them so special? Everybody's special, or nobody's special. We should just deal with this on a realist basis. And I think that has been building for a long time, and Donald Trump has sort of brought it out into the public. And at the end of the day, the relationship between the U.S. and Canada is really a relationship between the people. And while policy experts can have this conversation and understand that it's not personal, I think what's been so disruptive in this era is the challenge to what we thought of as a friendship between the countries, between the peoples. Now, nothing is taken for granted. Everything is earned. You don't get a concession in a trade negotiation unless you pay for it. And that's kind of roughness that we haven't seen in Canada's relations in my lifetime.
I'll just take straight off from that. Your opening sentence that the Canada-U.S. relationship has been disrupted by the presence of Donald Trump. I would say that most of the activity, most of the thinking carried out by the current federal government in Canada has been disrupted, has been taken over by the presence of Donald Trump. So it doesn't matter what political color you are, whether you like Liberals or Conservatives or Green or NDP, I find it difficult not to give a lot of credit to the Canadian government for having dealt with the disruption of Donald Trump on the trade file. So NAFTA is in place. NAFTA is terribly important for Canada. It's frankly less important quantitatively for the United States, but it's hugely important for Canada, and NAFTA was under threat. And so an enormous effort went forward, which was frankly kind of multi-partisan, transpartisan, federal, provincial, get everybody on the team to go away and convince everybody that would listen in the United States, whether they're in Washington or whether they're in the States, and governors, et cetera, to make them realize the importance of the trade relationship. And at the end, what we ended up with was more or less NAFTA. We ended up with basically the same agreement, but it took 3 years, a massive amount of energy. It's like when you're doing home renovations, spending $100,000 to build an extra room, that's kind of cool. But that's not what you got here. You spent $100,000 to fix your foundation. You think, oh, like, what do I get out of that? Well, it's kind of crucial. It's kind of crucial, but you don't really have anything to show for it. And that has taken over Canadian politics in 3 out of the last 4 years.
And is this a bigger question? Rania, I mean, is global trade becoming more regional? Why is it that all of a sudden we're having a need to renovate the foundations of trade? Why is that becoming an issue? Is that unique to the president, or is it something that's been with us since even before Donald Trump?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think it's something we talk about a lot now because of the 2016 election and sort of all this discussion of free and fair trade. But if you look at the data, which is what I'm supposed to do, there's a lot of sort of interesting things there post-financial crisis that I think show us that there has been this move to sort of a greater regionalization in trade. And so I think basically beginning in 2011, you see that there's been sort of more onshoring going on. So a lot of countries, because of the amount of uncertainty that they see with, future trade deals, even dating back then, well, that's not that far back, but it's further back in 2016, makes them want to sort of have their value chains closer to home, or the trade that they engage in with other countries in intermediate goods closer to home. So I think part of that is uncertainty. The other part, I think, is sort of touching on the panel earlier, is populism post a big recession. There's a big push to protect your jobs. And so, yeah, we have seen this sort of happening, and I think if you want to look forward a bit, there are two interesting sort of things that I'd point out. And the first is that I think by construction, we're going to have more regionalization of trade, because if trade in goods sort of starts to wane, but trade in services starts to pick up, there are some services that are tradable, but considerably fewer than goods. So things like pharmaceuticals, I guess education to some degree, but these are all sort of hairy issues now in the era of renegotiating trade deals, because they deal with AP. So I think looking forward, yes, this has been happening, but it predated President Trump.
And so if the foundation is changing, then let me ask the panel, describe how the foundation is changing. Give the audience some color. What is changing in the foundation of U.S. and Canada trade?
It's a whole bunch of things. And I really agree with Rania that these are long-standing trends that we've been coping with that just become visible, I think, to some of us more recently. One of the phrases that you hear a lot with regard to the Trump administration is that he's brought this America First attitude towards international affairs and economic policy. And I have to tell you, America's always been America first. This has always been our way. And what's changed underlying that is the nature of the political economy, to come to one of Tom's great themes. In the very beginning of Canada-US trade, Canada was in the British Empire taking part in a mercantilist system, and the United States was expanding inward. And so we had an internal market, which was what we were developing with our own version of import substitution industrialization that Canada then picks up with the national policy. Around the beginning of the 20th century, thanks to Henry Ford and others, what happened in the United States was that we mastered mass production. Standardization and in precision parts that could be interchangeable, and the miracle of economies of scale. The more you produce, the lower your unit cost. And while we had a large internal market, we were so productive in those early years, we were able to think exports. And the world was divided up into empires and regional trading blocks, and we wanted to break down those barriers, liberalize the trade, so we could get access to more markets. And there's a great literature. Ray Vernon talking about the product cycle and in the ways in which the U.S. exploited this system. But the U.S. was a champion of liberalization because it wanted to sell more of its stuff and dominate the world. Very much America first. What changed a little bit, and I think that's really important now, is that the U.S. ran into some limits in its ability to liberalize. The International Trade Organization, that was the Bretton Woods institution that died on the table after the Havana Conference, was replaced by the GATT, which made progress but only made so much. And I think one of the signal events was, while we had encouraged Europe to do regional integration with the European community in order to hopefully stave off future conflict, when Britain joined the European Union, it was a turning point. And Tom, you'll remember what the writing was like in these days, because you probably read it when you were in school. There were many Canadian writers, and I think about Dennis Stairs, but also others, who said Britain turned its back on the colonies. It turned its back on the Commonwealth in order to join Europe, and its supply chain shifted. And Canada subsequently, even in the first Trudeau government, began to think seriously about free trade with the U.S. Not because that was their first choice, but because they felt that they had been abandoned. You think about Granite Steen's famous title, how Britain's weakness pushed Canada into the arms of the United States, but it was very true in an economic point of view. And so as Britain and Europe went deeper into regionalism, the U.S. found in Canada a partner to do North American regionalism, and that was the story. Rania is exactly right, though, at the same time. There are products for which there are global markets, semiconductors, certain kinds of financial services, but there are an awful lot of markets where the production platform makes sense regionally. We make cars in North America, not so much in South America anymore. We make cars in Asia, we make cars in Europe, but not a lot of other places. We used to have manufacturing in the Middle East. We had manufacturing of automobiles in South Africa, but that just doesn't happen anymore. So certain products have consolidated. And where the U.S. is now, it realizes it's block to block. We have to realign the blocks. And my last comment on this, in terms of why I think foundations are different, I don't think Donald Trump is disingenuous when he calls the agreement we now have the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement and not a free trade agreement. Because it's not about liberalizing trade. It's about redistributing the benefits of that trade to put more of them in the United States. He's renegotiating the deal. I'm always reminded of Darth Vader in Cloud City when Lando Calrissian says, "We had a deal," and Darth Vader says, "Pray I don't alter it further." That's very much the Donald Trump approach on USMCA. And that's, I think, why the USITC and the IMF have said the gains are going to be pretty minor. It's not about gains. It's about redistribution in our favor and forcing Canada and Mexico to take that.
The point I would make on the foundation is, an important part of the foundation is the perceptions of the foundation. And so this connects to the populism point, it connects to the globalization. I would think about globalization, technological innovation, and immigration. Those are three touch points where, if you talk to economists about the benefits of trade and globalization, and the benefits of immigration and the benefits of technological change, like we all know what those stories are, but there is a downside from each of those as well. And the economist's sort of habit is to say, well, the gains outweigh the losses, and so let's push ahead. But there are losses, there are losers in each one of those three. And I think Donald Trump, whether it's his brilliance or something else, I think tapped into those three sets of concerns. And I don't think he offered a solution to any of them, but he absolutely tapped into those concerns. And I think in Canada, we fool ourselves in thinking that maybe we don't have the same concerns. And I think we do have the same concerns. They may not be quite as large as they are in the United States, but those issues of disruption in the labor market caused by technological change, about what should the scale of immigration be and what should our immigration system be based on, and are there downsides from excessive immigration, and what are they, and the losses that need to be addressed through increased globalization. Those are genuine concerns. They need genuine and serious debates, and for the most part, you tend to be frowned upon if you raise issues, especially on the immigration front. You tend to be labeled a xenophobe if you actually raise any of the downside issues about immigration. So in Canada, I think we have to think about those issues. They do tap into populist sentiment, but the perception that the system isn't working, whether it's true or not, is quite another matter. The perception that the system isn't working and that the system's not working for a huge swath of the middle class is a very real issue.
And so I'll go one question further then. Is it working? Is the system working?
Well, so if you want to talk about rising income inequality, we can debate what the appropriate measure is of income inequality or wealth inequality, but most of the measures you look at will show that income inequality and wealth inequality declined during what is often called the Great Compression, during the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and then started rising again, and it has risen quite considerably in the United States. It is rising in Canada. So I think it's hard to deny that there is greater income inequality. What's the much tougher debate is to say, what is driving that income inequality? And actually, is inequality the bad thing? Or is poverty the bad thing? I think most people would agree that having a lot of people in the low end of the income distribution is a challenge, and you kind of want to raise those incomes in the lower tail. But it's a much tougher debate to then say, all right, if we worry about raising the absolute level of that lower tail, suppose we do that, but we still have this massive upper tail and we have the income inequality. Is that a problem? And why is that a problem? And does it undermine the political system? Does it undermine social cohesion? These are tough issues.
But I was just going to say, I think that is exactly right, and you would pick this up, Tom, as well. There's a sense in which, in the Great Compression, the bottom was rising, the middle class was growing, and the rich end was not as rich.
Right.
And then what happened in the 90s and 2004 was we saw the wealthy end go up. And there's nothing bad about that. It showed up in good economic
low
growth
end
numbers,
wasn't.
but the low end was stagnant,
That's right.
in some cases falling. And that's the problem. And this is why political economy, no offense to the economists out there, is such a nice combination, because economic movements like this have political consequences, regardless of their merits on economics. Politics still matters, especially in democracies like ours.
And let me even take this question of are things working a bit further. Just this past week, the Bank of Canada reduced its projection for what potential economic growth is in Canada, as it's been doing every year for the last pretty much decade since the Great Recession. In the United States, there's a great debate about what potential economic growth is. The numbers are surely lower than they were 15 or 20 years ago. People now think it's normal for the economy to grow at best at around 2%, and scholars argue, is the right number actually 1.5%? Are we taking risks by growing faster than 1.5%? That would have sounded ludicrous from the perspective of even the 2000s, let alone the perspective of the 1960s, 70s, 50s, let alone 1920s or 10s. So maybe throwing the question even further afield, is the issue whether or not our trade policies are optimizing things overall but causing inequality, or is there a deeper question? Why are we growing so slowly, and how's that impacting CanadaUS
It's a nice
relations?
segue into monetary policy. I like that.
Yes.
But you should be the first one on this one.
So why does it matter why we're growing so slowly? I guess, yeah, we do spend a lot of time thinking about the distributions, and not a ton of time maybe thinking about the levels. But I think there has been this view that a rising tide lifts all boats, and maybe we can debate the truth of that. But if we're already, especially in wealthy countries like Canada, I don't know that you have to see, the 4, 5, 6% growth rates that you see in countries like China. So if the question is, to what end do we think about and care about the level of growth? Maybe it's bringing people out of poverty, or like urbanization, the sort of thing that you would talk about with respect to China. In Canada, which is a wealthy country, maybe we, especially as an economist, we sort of agonize over the 10 basis points of difference over the Bank of Canada's April forecast and their January forecast, but does it really matter?
It's a huge point one, huge point one.
So on the growth rate, if you look back 15 years ago, 10 years ago, kind of 3% was a pretty normal, I'm talking about real annual GDP growth. 3% was a pretty normal number for potential growth. It's now, kind of, as you said, it's now considered sort of 2% for Canada, United States. The United States a little higher. Most of that is to be expected from demographics. So, the baby boom generation, which is that, massive increase in fertility, basically, and population growth between 1946 and 1962 or 3, those people started retiring in 2011. And so some of them are lingering, right, in the labor force. Some of them don't retire right at 65, and so there's some slippage there. But for the most part, that decline from 3%, give or take, to 2%, give or take, is mostly about demographics. It's mostly about aging. And that's all fairly predictable. I think actually what's the bigger debate is the Larry Summers sort of secular stagnation debate about, are we in a world where the nature of investment, because of the nature of technological change and the rise of Silicon Valley and the digital economy, means that investment is like what we call capital I in the national accounts is just a different thing than it used to be 50 years ago. And, are we doing a lot less investment? Do we have to do a lot less investment than we had to before? Because of the population aging, do we have a higher kind of natural saving rate? And so there's this quite reasonable discussion and debate about what is that neutral interest rate. And that translates also into growth rate. So I think that debate is pretty live. I think the demographic stuff is, except around the edges, it's pretty predictable.
Can I just add, I think bring this back to on the fiscal side and public policy, we all know our Stolper-Samuelson theorem that, that when trade changes happen, benefits tend to go to the agile factor. And what does that mean in real terms? The young, the educated, without a mortgage, ability to pick up and go where the jobs are. And so I think one of the challenges we have, and I'd say more in the United States than in Canada, is raising the quality and the applicability of education and extending that to more people. I mean, our public schools vary widely. We have some great ones and we have some crummy ones. A young person growing up in the United States does not have a guarantee of a good educational opportunity. And when it comes to college, I'm sorry to say from Hopkins, don't tell anybody that I said this, we're really expensive. And we've been financing a huge growth in the cost of American colleges and universities, much more than in Canadian context, on the backs of the baby boomers' houses. And we've got grandparents signing student loans for their kids who then get in trouble because they don't get a job straight out of school. And then the grandparents are being dinged on their retirement income to help pay off their grandkids' student loans. It's a terrible situation. So that's something the policy can fix. And one of the challenges I think the US faces, Canada to a lesser extent, although some of this will carry on, is how do we create the agility and flexibility in our workforce, in our rising generation, so that as changes come, and they will, people are in a better position to shift and take advantage of those so that poverty is alleviated and we're all in better shape.
And so maybe to go back to our theme of American exceptionalism, in the United States, these things were never taken for granted. The basic assumption was that if demographics are turning bad, if total fertility is falling, it can come back up, as it did after falling in the 70s and reviving in the 80s. Demographics aren't really destiny. Demographics can change. They're just destiny over a sort of short time horizon, the amount of time it takes to change demographic trends. I see some head nodding. I like this.
No, but you finish your sentence.
That's it. That's a full sentence.
Go for it.
No, that I was going to say demographics don't have to be destiny if you want to have a lot of immigration, right? So this gets on to the point of we have to design maybe a better immigration policy. But I know right now the market is a bit obsessed with this idea of Japanification, and is that going to happen to Europe, to some lesser degree to the US? And it seems like the answer to that problem is on the one hand, demographics and migration and immigration. But that's a political economy question and not an economy question, Professor Sands. Yeah.
So on the demographics and the population aging, I think there's, as my father used to say, there's nothing wrong with getting old. It's better than the alternative. There's nothing wrong with an economy that has zero population growth. Right? Whether you have that with fertility exactly at replacement rates, or whether you have a lower fertility rate and you have some immigration. You can have zero population growth, you can have a small population growth, you can even have population decline. There's no theory, no good theory that I know that says that real living standards, so what you're now talking about is sort of per capita income, where that really relies on positive population growth. Positive population growth, of course, will drive aggregate GDP growth, but not necessarily per capita GDP growth. So we shouldn't agonize over a low fertility rate. I mean, typically what happens, you look across country, across time, when people get richer and they get more educated, and those two things tend to happen together, they also start to have fewer babies. There is something, I suspect, fairly natural or inevitable about that. To me, the problem with population aging, and Canada has this more than the United States, we all had a baby boom, but the United States has population growth in segments of its population that we don't have. So population aging is a little bit more serious of an issue in Canada. But to me, it's not about aggregate GDP growth or per capita GDP growth that's the real issue. It's that we've built our public institutions, largely kind of 50 years ago, in a world where the demographics was working in our favor, in the sense that you could have pay-as-you-go systems. Well, you probably don't want to have pay-as-you-go systems if the population pyramid is going to turn into a population something else, whatever the opposite of a pyramid is. And that's what's going to happen. So what you need to do is you need to recognize that, oh, okay, as Canadians age, we're going to spend more on healthcare. That is just inevitable. And we're going to spend more on elderly benefits. That is probably a good thing and inevitable. But what we have to do is pay for it. So you can put it on the charge card, but then you're going to run up your public debt. Now, Canada, our public debt is very low, and so if you want to put it on the public debt, well, you can. Probably better to actually raise taxes a few percentage points so that you can actually pay for that. So you want to kind of make sure that your healthcare system and your elderly benefits aren't relying on that young population that is going to be disappearing. United States, different situation. United States, aggregate debt is way higher and aiming up, not down, in terms of debt GDP ratio. But also, the Social Security system is unfunded, and it is an absolute train wreck. So their debt is high and rising, and their public Social Security system is unfunded. Canada's debt is low and falling, and in fact, our CPP is basically fully funded for 75 years. So we're in different situations. But to me, the impact of population aging is you got to kind of de-link the fiscal structure from the age structure of the population.
It's funny. So you reminded me of ways in which the United States is exceptional, not in good ways. But I think, and someone will know the actual answer to this, but I think it was Churchill who said that God looks out for small children, drunks in the United States of America. And, you know, there's this great faith we have in the U.S. that we can somehow muddle through. But I want to kind of highlight something on immigration, which is really important. Immigration has a very good popular support in Canada for a couple of reasons. One of them is that Canada has a skills-based immigration system, which it tinkers with, which has meant that most new Canadians quickly enter the middle class and do not become a burden on the taxpayer, et cetera, et cetera. The United States has taken a very different approach, and so immigration is much more a social challenge because we have a weaker social net, and we bring in people who will often struggle to find work or work only in the unskilled labor and don't do well and bring with them some poverty and some other concerns. And they still have young kids and tend to have better birth rates, but then you've got to educate those kids. We also have another problem, and I think it's important to situate immigration in a global migration context. The U.S., because it's a magnet for opportunity, has great universities, has often brought in people who could be the leaders of developing countries. Whether it's India or China, Southeast Asia, Latin America, they come, they get a great American education and often stay, or they go and work for the IMF and so on and so forth. And that we're conscious in some ways in the United States that what this means is ultimately, talk about income inequality, a U.S. that renews itself and prospers and developing countries that remain poor and struggle with bad government, incompetence, state capacity problems. One of the things I think we're dealing with in terms of trade, bringing it back to your subject, is that the U.S. made a pivot that we didn't really want to acknowledge, which was most of the time we were for trade liberalization because we wanted to export to those countries, to other countries, and get them to give up import substitution and industrialization. But after, in this wonderful holiday for history, after the end of the Cold War, the U.S., starting with a little bit the Uruguay round, but most importantly this defunct Seattle round and then the dead Doha round of the GATT, made an offer. And that was, developing countries, give up your remaining protectionism and we will let you grow using export-led growth, which was a model that the U.S. initially pioneered in the context of recovering Europe and Japan after World War II. Export-led growth. We have the money, we'll buy your stuff, you can produce it cheaply, but by selling stuff to us, you'll get rich enough to build up your country, build up the services, and we'll all share. This is a strategy behind the BRICS and so on. The problem is that in transition, that meant the people who were in the low-skilled area now competing with cheap labor in other countries lost their jobs. There was very poor trade adjustment assistance. There's great documentation on why we said we were helping people in those situations, we didn't. And so we built up resentment. We financed this transition, which was meant, I think, in the best of intentions way, to help countries grow. And then we ended up stealing their best people, and we gave some of the jobs of our poorest people away. And that unfairness eventually caught up with us, not in Bill Clinton's day when this all started, but in Donald Trump's day.
Wasn't it also that the hope that the developing countries would have an export-led growth was based on, I think, the assumption that a lot of their exports would be agricultural based, but the rich countries weren't prepared to give up their protection, subsidization, I don't know, monopoly position, if you like, of the export sector.
Agriculture, I would also say clothing, garments, the multi-fiber agreement. There were all these areas we expected would be potential, and they didn't pan out.
And Rania, how does this leave things looking right now?
Well, yeah, I was going to ask Professor Sands a question actually about this.
Okay.
But I think it's interesting because now we see in the newly negotiated USMCA, CUSMA, whatever. I should say CUSMA in Canada, I think.
We just call it NAFTA.
NAFTA, right.
It still is NAFTA. There is no CUSMA or
Right, for now. Yeah, that's true. But it's interesting in that the new agreement has this paragraph now, or sorry, I think one of the sections in the 30s, so way at the end, about trade with non-market economies. Yeah,
right.
Of course he knows which one it is.
Impressive.
I told you it would be a wonky panel, and it is.
Yeah, so I mean, and I think this goes to this idea that trade is becoming more regional. So now we have this deal that's the U.S., Canada, Mexico deal, as Dov pointed out. And now we're also, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, I don't know if it has any kind of legal standing, but now we're also kind of, the U.S. is sort of saying we'd prefer if you didn't trade with China, basically, is the way I read Section 3210. And I guess, I don't know if you have any ideas about where that leaves us in the sort of the WTO system. Is the U.S. going to be managing trade for us, for the world now, for Canada specifically? I think there are a lot of interesting questions. I guess I should be answering some of them.
And is this an implication of tectonic changes in the global economy that you explained?
So yeah, a couple of things. This is such a great question. Thank you, Rania. So first of all, I think we're lucky that 3210 is the way it is, because my understanding from talking to people around the negotiation was the U.S. initial proposal was you may not open negotiations with non-market economies, period. And other than China, we're probably talking about North Korea, Iran, a few others that might hit that list, but China is the big one. And the Trudeau government was able to soften it to, you may, but you must share all the information about your negotiation with the Americans and I suppose the Mexicans, so that you have permission, but no one will think that you can do a separate deal on the outside. And to me, this is well, it's better, but the way that Europe has done this is they have a customs union, one tariff for everybody. And when they negotiate on trade, they negotiate together. And it's complicated, it's a pain in the neck, but North America didn't do a customs union. Now, if we want a customs union, we should pay for it. That is to say, if you have to accept our tariff rates and all our tariff politics, then you get some extra access to our market, or we compensate you for that. But we're actually asking you to suffer the limits of a customs union without giving you any of the benefits. In fact, we're taking away some of your free trade. So in that sense, at least from Canada's point of view, to quote Donald Trump, the new agreement is a bad deal. I don't think it's very good for you. That said, now kind of stepping forward, the administration is convinced, and in some ways that conviction is becoming reality, that we are now in an era of great power rivalry. And there is a big distinction between a China and an India, because China is a rival and viewed as hostile by the U.S., whereas, and maybe Russia, whereas Europe and India are not. That has real policy consequences because, as some of you will know, Americans are obsessed with security and we think like a big power, which is different than how middle powers think, which I think is significant, but in this case, quite significant. Ever since 9/11, the U.S. argument was global security was about dealing with transnational networks of terrorists, organized crime, and we retooled our military and our security services and our intelligence services and our cooperation with others to combat that threat, including homegrown terrorism. Very serious. Suddenly, the U.S. is pivoting to, we may need to go to a near-peer conflict that could be World War III. That, and unlike past presidents, although more, I guess, they're all guilty of some of this, the U.S. doesn't say, oh, we have this discrete Chinese economic rivalry, and we have this other discrete strategic rivalry, military rivalry. It's all one. And Trump is playing those things off of each other. And for those of you who are young, I'm trying to bring back a word from the Cold War that we all used to know back in those days, but we haven't used in a while, brinksmanship. That's Trump's strategy. Take us to the brink. See how close you can get without blowing up the world. That's not a great world to live in.
So the big power politics is not just about military. So this is fascinating. So it was just in the newspaper this morning that I was reading about the second Belt and Road Initiative conference going on, I think today or for a few days.
We like to call it the Belt and Road Forum because then it's barf.
Okay. Okay, so that's good. You heard it here, folks. So the Belt and Road Initiative. So China has, as we know, massive accumulation of assets and foreign exchange reserves. So if you want to use that to a segue to monetary policy in a few minutes, you can do that. But they've got massive assets. They want to invest them in the world. And so here they are now, African countries, not exclusively African, but many African countries, basically lining up at the door in Beijing to have money lent to them or have money invested in equity positions. So China is looking to do this. They want to develop the infrastructure in Africa, but they also want to have influence. Now, is America sitting by neutrally? No, America is looking at this and saying, whoa, we don't want China to have that influence. I mean, this is now take it back to the Marshall Plan. This is kind of like America, helping, I think for quite reasonable reasons, but also quite self-interested reasons, helping Europe post-World War II. Well, China is helping Africa. There's no war that is following. But America is looking at this, and now they have come up with their competing Belt and Road Initiative, which is currently smaller than the Belt and Road Initiative, but could well be bigger within a few years. But they are now saying, well, we don't want China to be lending that money because you will basically be in a debt trap. You will become indebted to China, and we would rather that, effectively they're saying, we'd rather that you become indebted to us. And so it is now a contest of sphere of influence through economic relationships. And it's not just military, but it's military as well.
Rania.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think there's a lot of worry about having a debt renegotiation happen outside of the Paris system, and without the IMF, without these organizations that America does, have more influence in than China at present, just giving voting shares, et cetera. So, yeah, I agree. Yeah.
So this sounds like we have summarized a huge change in the way in which commercial diplomacy and trade negotiation goes on. We've discussed a world in which trade negotiations suddenly become about great power politics, in which it's therefore become regionalized as well. We'll have to go to questions soon, but I want to conclude before then with one topic that I know is near and dear to the heart of one of our panelists, which we haven't yet touched on, and which is exclusive, which only works globally, namely the question of climate policy. In this regionalized world, how do you have environmental policy or climate policy?
So let me start with Chris's opening sentence. Climate policy has been disrupted by the presence of Donald Trump. So in Canada, climate policy is, it's interesting. And climate policy basically started in a serious way at the provincial level. The federal government has now come in to fill in the gaps, and it is becoming a very hot political issue and is likely to be the top or one of the top 3 political issues in the coming election. The United States, climate policy is on hold. There are some states and some groups of states that have actually done some quite good things, but from a national perspective, climate policy and certainly carbon pricing is nowhere to be seen, except, and Tom Velk will like this, so what is often called the Baker-Schultz plan, but it has a proper name that is geeky and I forget. But it is, this is the one that has been signed off and endorsed by 27 Nobel Prize winning economists and every living head of the Fed and et cetera, et cetera. And it's a 4-point plan for climate change in the United States. Point number 1 is a broad-based economy-wide carbon price that scales up over time. Number 2 is you take every penny of those revenues and you return it in equal per capita dividends across the United States. Element 3 is near and dear to many Republicans' hearts, which is you now, in the presence of a good and rising carbon price, you now repeal all of the regulations that you no longer need because they are redundant. That means you don't gut the EPA, but you actually repeal the regulations that are made redundant by a good carbon price. And then the 4th part of the policy is that you effectively put tariff carbon-based tariffs on the import of goods. And that's a game changer, right? Once America starts putting tariffs on the import based on carbon content of foreign goods, then you've got a real incentive for other countries to jump on board. That 4-point plan is being put forward by a group of very prominent Republicans. That's a very coherent, economically and politically coherent plan. So that might be the beginning of a change in the United States. But climate policy, as you said, Dov, it's a global collective action problem, right? So you need countries to participate with 197 other countries to try to push each other along, but you need them to each go back to their own respective countries and put in policies. You can't really argue with a straight face at a UN conference if you're not doing something at home. You've got to do both. But having the U.S. involved in a serious way would make a huge difference.
Interesting. There's so many more topics we could touch on in our panel. Hopefully, though, we'll hear them raised by members of the audience. Do we have any questions? I ask that people keep their questions to exclusively one sentence, with the exception of Professor Tom Velk, who could do whatever he would like. And we'll. Wow. And I knew his hand was up. His hand was up throughout the panel. So please, someone pass Professor Velk a microphone, and he'll kick off the questions.
Yeah, you need it, Tom. You need it. You need it.
But you're recording. Okay, record. All right. Okay. I'll yell that loud. It'll scare the tape. Okay. There's more than this lead word is one sentence in itself. Factor price equalization, and it's an optimistic point that I'd like to make about income distribution, tops and bottom. Planet-wide, trade makes the poorest people better off. When's the last time somebody died of famine in China? Even places like Cambodia, Vietnam, and so on, and even in Africa, trade is making the bottom richer and happier and healthier. The top is also coming down in the rest of the world, in places in Africa, in Asia, in the sense that you don't have so many dictators, if nothing else, who have not just the power to have a nice car, but they have the power to kill people by the tens of thousands. They are replaced by our managers, who are coming up, of course, as the managers in Africa and Asia come down. So what's happening, yes, in the West, the top is moving away from the bottom, and the bottom is dropping down, because at the bottom, you're competing with the workers from Asia and Africa, and they are coming up. There's so many more of them, though, in Asia and Africa, that planet-wide, it's better, because there are fewer really poor people. And likewise for our managers, who now have to manage the rest of the world. Todd just left because he's one of the guys that manages the rest of the world, and he was busy going off to manage it, as near as I can tell. Guys like him are replacing the dictators of the rest of the world. So planet-wide, anyhow, income distribution is getting better. I don't like Piketty, because all he does, Piketty for the rest of you, non-economists, all we look at is these picky little guys. Piketty is a picky little guy. All he did was look at income distribution in the West. Yes. That's the wrong place to look. You got to look planet-wide. It's getting better.
Profound point, that income inequality, the discourse around it in the West is only about how it's rising, but of course the perspective is entirely different if you're in China, elsewhere. Other questions from the audience? I believe that there are microphones, so maybe if someone could pass the microphones to people with questions, or just go to the microphones, please.
Could I ask one?
Please.
It's more of a comment and a question.
Well, but you have to obey the one-sentence rule.
One sentence. Why didn't you were talking finally about the demography, how important that is. Why didn't you mention the fertility rate?
I did mention fertility rate.
Because this is absolutely a key factor. Every developed country in the world has a fertility rate well below the stable 2.1 number.
It's a profound point, and this actually leads to, if I may offer a comment, though I'm the moderator, not supposed to comment. I agree that per capita GDP is ultimately what matters, and you could have good growth in per capita GDP without any demographic increase. Indeed, Japan demonstrates that. Japan has gotten substantially richer, even as the country, Japan's overall GDP has grown at extremely low, slow paces.
Yes, but not to quibble, I think the other thing that we've missed talking about here is the connection between a couple of things. Japan is a great example, and I would add to that China. So the Trump administration thinks the trade is imbalanced with China because they sell us more than we buy from them. But as everybody knows, the current account is balanced out by the capital account. And what have they been doing? They've been buying our debt.
Not everybody knows that. Apparently the U.S. president is unclear on that.
Okay, well, everybody but Trump knows. And so if we do succeed in driving down Chinese sales of products in the United States by hook or crook, we may find that our fiscal position becomes unsustainable because no one will have the money to lend us to continue to sustain our unsustainable social programs.
I want to come back to demographics. So, sir, you're quite right. So during the baby boom, 3.6 children per woman was the fertility rate in Canada, 1946 to 1962, as an average. It is now about 1.6. So it's below the 2.1 replacement rate. So you're quite right that that's relevant. From a public policy point of view, however, it is quite a challenge. So you think about what the fertility rate is, okay? We know how to change or to increase the fertility rate privately.
Is this a sex ed segue?
Yes, that's good. Thank you for
I'm
saying
getting
that. So we
uncomfortable.
know how to do it privately, but we do not know how to do it publicly very easily. So you can talk about providing, in this province, for example, $7 a day daycare. Does that actually have an impact on fertility? And is it a cost-effective way to improve fertility? Well, we can have a big debate about that. But there is no magic policy wand to increase fertility rates. And back to the basic point about as countries develop, as they get richer, as they get more educated, there is, empirically at least, there is absolutely a decline in fertility rates. So we can talk about ways to increase fertility and think about whether they're good ways and whether they are expensive. Or we can talk about, we can talk about ways to deal with a low fertility rate economy. So then you can open up the gates on immigration. And in Canada, we've got roughly 1 or slightly less than 1% annual population growth. We've got a fertility rate of 1.6 or 1.7, so our immigration is actually bringing us up to positive population growth. And more countries can do that. But I think my instinct is that we should actually think about dealing with rather than raising a low fertility rate.
Interesting. We have a question in the front.
So in the panel, was described that for various factors, there is now seems to be like a change in terms of the foundation of US-Canada relationship, and it seems that there's maybe like a shift in Washington consensus on how to make policies more beneficial to US, maybe vis-a-vis Canada, vis-a-vis like a re-evaluation of China policy and all of that. Trump may or may not have been a catalyst, the last straw that broke the camel's back kind of thing. So question one is, do you think that this kind of Washington consensus shift is more permanent and will go beyond Trump? And second, if that is the case, what is the policy prescription for Canada in such a shift?
All right, that's a very good question, and let me see if I can do it justice. I think that there is no Washington consensus at the moment. There are a lot of people.
You're using Washington consensus not in the
Latin sense,
not in that sense.
Yeah,
right?
I think so.
You mean a consensus in Washington?
I think the first problem is that there isn't really any certainty in our American establishment, let alone Donald Trump and his folks, about what direction we should go in and why. So it's fluid. And this is really hard for Canada because Canada is not a country that gets out ahead and drags the U.S. It's a country that tends to look at where the U.S. is going, digest it a bit, and then figure out how do we then fit into this plan. And often, for example, when the U.S. was pushing trade liberalization, Canada eventually knocks on the door and says, you know what, we could take this one step further and show you it could really work for both of us, which is great. That's why we love Canada as a neighbor. This is a really good quality. But right now, while the Americans are still having big debates about what the future of our political economy is, both domestically and in the world, it's very hard for Canada to navigate that and find a safe way out. So that's thing number one. I'm going to highlight two other things. Traditionally, the way in which Canada and the United States have managed our relationship, something that I don't think gets enough attention in the literature, is that the president and the prime minister can treat each other like peers, even though Canada's smaller, for long enough to come up with a political agreement on handling something complicated, which may be boring for the American president, but is essential for Canada. And that political agreement gets packed into an institution, which is then depoliticized, And I'll give you an example to make that clear. The International Joint Commission to deal with the boundary waters, the Great Lakes, etc. This is an issue that is way too boring for an American president. However, it is important. So Canada and the US get together, they agree on something, they have a commission. Unlike Europe, we don't delegate sovereignty. These people are fireable, and they have very limited ability to go beyond a strict remit. The governments could decide, but if you want accountability, you can fire your governments, because that democratic accountability stays. And that's one of the reasons our system between Canada and the US has been so durable. NORAD is another example. On 9/11, the commanders, the military, don't need to find Chrétien and President Bush to get orders on what to do. They know what they're supposed to do because that's been trained and that was agreed a long time ago. We're not going to worry about who's in whose airspace. We're just going to get the job done. To make that system work, there needs to be a fairly good agreement on those issues. I think we could expand putting more issues in this context. That leads to my third problem, American leadership. And this is going to sound American exceptionalist, sorry to be obnoxious about that. I think we underestimate the importance of the US having its mind made up. The US needs to know what it wants from Canada. Canada can say yes, no, maybe later. But if the US doesn't know what it wants, Canada's in the position of throwing gifts at it and guessing and saying, what could we do? Justin Trudeau going out of the White House and schmoozing Ivanka Trump for a women's entrepreneurship and business thing, which I've never heard of since. I mean, it was a noble cause, but he's just guessing. Like, what sounds good? How can I, say something nice to Trump so that he's nice? And I think that's a terrible position for Canada to be in. And my guess is it doesn't get better until first, there's a greater consensus within Washington about what we want, both from Canada and the world. And second, and this is the hard one, and it's going to sound like special pleading, the United States needs more people who know Canada well enough to begin to help Americans figure out what to do with you, if that doesn't sound too terrible.
It needs to hold this panel in Washington.
And we need more graduates, not just Canadians, but Americans who really study Canada and take it seriously, not just as a sidebar to studying Mexico because NAFTA came in, or just as a sort of gimmicky class, but they really take it seriously, because we don't need 1 million people like that, but we need more expertise. And I think, now to pick on Bill Clinton, when the US made the decision that Canada was going to be part of North America and the Western Hemisphere in terms of the way we internally organize, Canada's been managed by people whose specialty is Latin America, and that is not bad. They're not bad people, but they don't appreciate the potential for the Canada-US relationship, and so they constantly treat you with what George W. Bush famously called the soft bigotry of low expectations, and miss the real opportunity this relationship provides.
And at least for 5 months a year, those diplomatic missions to Canada could be very cold.
So very briefly, Canada obviously has to worry about the Canada-US relationship, but we also, as a small power, we also really rely on the international engagement. So we rely on the NORAD, we rely on the WTO and the UN, and these organizations. And one of the problems with Donald Trump is that it's not just America first, but it's kind of what does that America first mean? It kind of means that he doesn't really care about this international engagement. He's maybe even undermining some of these international organizations. So I think that's a problem for the world, and I think it's a problem for Canada. So I hope that this is what in economics we would call a temporary shock. I would hope that this problem goes away. It may not. Even if Donald Trump goes away, maybe his behavior has set a pattern. But I would hope that we kind of revert to normal American international engagement. In the meantime, I think we hope for the best, and if we have to interfere in a foreign election, I'm in favor.
If I can just add one thing on the international dimension. So on the World Trade, the appellate court now has only 3 members, I believe, and there need to be 3 for it to be functioning. And I think 2 of them may retire by the end of this year. So we could see, and because I think that the current administration hasn't put forward any potential, or they've basically blocked judges from the European Union and other places that have been put forward by the Europeans, we might be in a position where there is no appellate court at the WTO, and that's at the end of this year. So I hope that this is something that's overcomeable, I suppose, but it seems like some of the deadlines are.
All right, well, let's do, so we're going to do a lightning round. This is how I like to do this. So each person will ask one sentence question, and the panel will just take it all up, and then, because we're past our time, but I'd love to hear from the audience, so please.
Okay, my question would be this. The U.S. is deliberalizing trade at an incredible rate right now. through sanctions. And this has happened since Clinton, since Obama, now exaggerated by Trump. And we're on the other side of some of these sanctions. We will trade with Iran. We're happy to trade with Iran. Probably less happy to trade with Saudi Arabia, but we're stuck. We'll trade with China. The Huawei affair is all tangled into this. This is just to punish us, or China, for, well, I would suggest for having the best technology in the world at the moment in 5G. What do you think about trade illiberalization? Is this ever going to reverse?
And our next question.
Do I have 1 minute or 2 minutes?
You have an excellent sentence.
I'm not an economist, so I don't look at the small things. I look at the big picture. So my big picture is, in terms of trades, whoever countries has a so-called trade deficit is because that country's economic situation is very strong. Otherwise, they won't have a trade deficit. So in this regard, I don't think Donald Trump was right, because over the last so many years, they gave China's economy was very bad, so they gave China a lot of benefits. So this is a broad statement. The other thing is, concerning the trade negotiations now between U.S. and Canada, and U.S. and especially U.S. and China, is the big thing that people pay attention to. At first they said they are going to conclude that in March, and now it's April, and now it would take a long time. But my opinion is, it really doesn't matter what kind of agreement they come out with, because once Donald Trump, as long as he is the president, in the 2 seconds that he does not agree with that agreement, he would just change it, and that's it. So the more important thing is, I want to ask the partners, what do you think Donald Trump's chances of re-election, because that's the more important than any of these discussions we are talking about. Well, thank you.
And one last question.
We speak a lot about demographics here in this panel, and one of the issues that I've seen is the difference between, and you spoke a little bit about it, the difference between the baby boom generation, and we haven't really discussed the millennial generation that's stepping into the workforce at this time. And you keep on seeing these articles around how the baby boom generation has essentially neglected this millennial generation, and how millennials don't have the wealth to be able to replace the baby boom generation. Is that true, first of all? And second of all, will there be a time where the millennials will be taking their rightful place to be able to control the economy, and also be in a representative portion where they're currently underrepresented in government, and slowly turn that around?
So millennials, Donald Trump, and trade sanctions. Final thoughts from the panel.
You want to go? I'm ready.
All right. I think Olivia's question about trade and sanctions is just a great, I don't know what the answer is, Olivia, but to me, it's a great example of where economics and politics comes together, because your trade theory, your factor price equalization, and your Stoper-Samuelson actually isn't the issue, right? It is the trade as part of the power politics. And how does it get done? It gets done carefully. And I don't know what the right way is to deal with that. Is it going away? I suspect not. It just seems to me that those sorts of tensions and those sorts of deals are going to be with us for a while, at least until I retire.
And they'll be with us
so I took the easy one.
Excellent.
So I want to opine on the potential re-election of the current president. But I think one thing that I think is important to understand is you make a good point about trade deficits. So I mean, I'm constantly in a trade deficit with my grocer, right? It's not a bad thing. I live in New York. I don't want to grow my own vegetables. So, like, ameliorating that it's a bit, I think that's the right way to think about it, basically, and I think that gets overlooked. So it's my
And Chris,
comment
any
on that.
final words?
Oh man, there's so much there. So,
The demographics.
right. So, a couple things. One, I do think Trump is likely to get reelected. I'm sorry to say, all the baby boomer presidents have had 2 terms, and it's mechanical, data-driven politics, and the Democrats are a mess. So, who knows? But I think so we have to cope with it. What does that mean? 2 things. Millennials, for us, in 2016, were the largest voter cohort based on registration. They were not big voters. Maybe 20% of them actually showed up in 2016. Now, why? I talked to my students, it's because, well, we don't like Donald Trump, but we thought Hillary Clinton was going to win, but we didn't like her, so we didn't really want to vote for her and have that hanging over our heads for the rest of our lives, so we just didn't participate. In 2018, during the midterms, you saw a huge boost in U.S. voter turnout, and it was all millennials who finally decided that that was a mistake. So I think millennials are coming into their own. That's significant for Canada because 2019 will be the first election in which millennials are the largest voting cohort for Canada. You're a little behind us on that, but very close. So that's a factor. If you don't vote, you can't change any of this. And I think millennials are already starting to change the debate. Give you an example, the Green New Deal. You talked about the environment. The Green New Deal is full of all sorts of impractical, impossible things. But when I talk to young people, they're inspired by it. And they don't care if you can't do it. It's just you're talking about the right things. And I see that in Trudeau all the time. You're a lovely prime minister who will say, and I mean lovely in a very manly way, but he will aspire. He'll lead you forward, but he may not deliver on the promises. And for some people, that's good enough. It's all about having the right posture on the challenges. And so I think that's another way in which millennials will change the world. And my final thought for you is I don't give up hope, whether it's on sanctions or trade balance, because I think that where we're headed in a second Trump term or in the new term of whoever gets elected in the U.S. is going to be a settling of all this disruption. And the 2 big pieces, I think, are a return to the Paris Accords, because I think Donald Trump, who's not anti-environment, is quite right that it was a bad deal. The U.S. makes a lot of painful cuts first, China and India, if and when we get to a certain point. A deal in which we all move forward is probably healthier. Secondly, the WTO. I think we're going to go back to a new WTO round. Less developed country status for China that they get to voluntarily give up and until then don't have to accept the disciplines, unacceptable. So we're moving in that direction. We will be having these debates, and I hope as better persons in charge, but that'll be up to the millennials. So go out there and vote, kids.
All right, thank you everybody for this panel. It's fantastic. Take a 10-minute break and we'll resume shortly.